In fact, talking with doctoral students, I'm constantly shocked at their inability to put forward a clear thought that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. They speak in sentence fragments. They say a subject, they can't think of the verb, they back up and start over again, and they sprinkle throughout the entire sentence the word you know 500 times, followed by like, man, you know, but a lot of incidental mutterings and gruntings that have very little semantic import. I think it's clear that somebody who is able to say with lucidity a statement that has a beginning and a middle and an end, and who doesn't have to go back and forth, and who doesn't have to introject ums and ers and ahs and lots of you-knows. In fact, I have one person who now says so many you-knows in the sentence that he's even condensed the you-know to yon. I couldn't believe it. He says yon, yon, yon. He even says 3 or 4 you-knows in a row so that you get yon, yon, yon. It sounds like another language almost. I really felt we should tape record it and give it to him so he could hear how incredibly disjointed his expression of thought is because of this interruption. Well, I'll get off my sermon now and go to the next branch of philosophy, which has to do with axiology. And we have taken particular note of this field of philosophy because it deals with a study of values. And its subunits might be these: ethics, aesthetics, and political or social philosophy. Its main questions are, what is good and what is bad? Somebody asked a question here, is man good or evil? Well, that's essentially an axiological question. It also has something to do with the nature of being, too. And as I said, these fields are interrelated. One of the central problems running down through all philosophy, as Whitehead phrases it, is the question of manyness or oneness. Is there one truth, or are there many truths? Is there one reality, or is there many realities? Is there one value, or are there many values? Well, I don't think we're going to get to a full discussion of all those questions, but you should have an idea of what they mean. Now, we would like all of the people who are working with ANISA children to help them become maybe not professional philosophers, but children who are comfortable with philosophical modes of thought. Now, children will ask many of these kinds of questions, and you will keep trying to force them over here most of the time. Now, the problem is we're not all equipped to handle this very well because, as is well known, any fool can ask a question to confound a wise man. The problem is how to respond to this kind of a question when you can't give an absolute answer, when you can't give the sort of philosophical answer that the child can understand. How can you respond to it without putting him off by trying to force him over here all the way? Well, we have yet to work out a systematic way of doing that, but we have some ideas. And it rests around breaking that question down into sub-questions where part of it can be answered on logical grounds alone. Now, so this isn't going to happen early in a child's life, but it can happen a lot earlier than we think it can. And I'll give you some examples of that perhaps a little later on. Now, I just want to give you a rundown on ways people have looked at philosophy, and you can place your own self in one of these camps. And I'm going to place Anissa in one of these camps. And by that time, we'll be time to have a break, and that will be the right introduction for coming back. Whitehead says that the most common attribute of the universe is change. And there will always be pressure upon every item in the universe to change. Part of that pressure will be internal, part of it will be external. Who was it who said, trouble is a constant. The trick is to get it on your own terms. Pressure is a constant. The trick is to get it on your own terms. There's pressure in the atmosphere. If you want the plane to go up in the air, arrange the pressures in such a way they are pushing in the direction you want to go. Now, the question is, there are what you might call ontological pressures on everybody. These are the ultimate questions of you and your life and where you're going. After all, we all face death at some point. You see, if I turned off the lights and said, and made it very quiet and say, I want all of you now to meditate on your own death. This could be a very unnerving experience. And I suspect that at some time when you're sitting in a chair, maybe the thought hits you, and you get a sort of a palpitation of the heart. Because the most fundamental kind of all anxiety is what Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, calls ontological anxiety. It comes when a being contemplates its non-being. Sort of shakes you up. Well, we all have ontological pressure on us. Now, the question is, how do we deal with that when it comes? Here are 7 ways that people deal with this, and then I want to say where Anissa fits in. There are some people who just refuse to recognize the issue. These are what I would call the complacent types. They said, well, I just try not to think about it. I'm not going to cry about it, I'm not going to weep about it, or I'm not even going to be joyful about it. I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist and get on with my operations. There's another group that will examine the issues, claim that they're too complex to do anything about, and simply reject any new proposals. These are the people who are negative about everything. They say no, 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 can't, won't, so on. 3, there are those whose focus is disbelief in everything. They are the skeptics. And they turn into cynics. And they're not the most joyful chaps to be around. But you know, working as a teacher in the school system is apt to make one a skeptic or a cynic, so you have to be very careful. It's not the most wholesome psychological position to be in. 4 are the people who just say, I don't know, I can't be sure of anything. This is the agnostic position. You know, gnosis means to know in Greek. And when you put a in front of a Greek word, it means no. So an agnostic is one who doesn't know. And we have come to regard an agnostic as somebody who says, who refuses to say that God exists, but he also won't say that God does not exist. And therefore he's on the fence. It's very hard to take any action if you're in the agnostic position. 5 is approach to try to compromise and hook everything together. This might be called the eclectic choice approach. You try to take a little bit of everything and hook it together. 6, examine everything and come to the conclusion that you should go back to a previous time and forget all this new stuff. That's what you might call the restorative choice. It's the conservative status quo position. Things were better 200 years ago. Let's go back to then. Of course, they were in many ways, but not in all ways, you see. That's what makes it difficult. Then there is the 7th position, which is where I place Anissa, which is to project a new future take it as a hypothesis and work to see whether or not it turns out the way you think it ought to. This is what I call the transformative approach or choice. Now, we are a little bit also in number 5, which is the eclectic choice, which selects bits and pieces from everything and tries to see how they're related. But our selection of these bits and pieces has not been an arbitrary sampling, like you just trot out all the philosophies of the universe, make a big smorgasbord, and grab yourself a plate and go by and nibble. A few beets here, a little corn there, a little cottage cheese here, and so on. No, that isn't the way we put the model together. We first tried to formulate a major hypothesis about the future and what education could be, and then begin to see what in that smorgasbord applies to that. Begin selecting, then modify the hypothesis, go back and see the smorgasbord, and we had this back and forth until the whole thing emerged. So, we reject the idea of the absolute skepticism position, and yet we meet a lot of that in the public school systems and in state departments of education. I think logically it is not a tenable position for anybody to be an absolute skeptic, because even if there were one, you could never refute him and he could never refute you, because he asserts that there is no knowledge or belief that can be justified in itself as an assertion. But you see, that in itself is an assertion, and therefore it contains its own self-rejection. And much philosophical thought can be discredited on the grounds that the statement itself rejects its own self, and therefore you're left without a foundation. Well, I want to we'll have a coffee break now. And when we come back, I want to talk about 2 basic laws of logic, 2 kinds of knowledge, an outline of Whitehead's conception of speculative philosophy, and then a discussion of first principles as the basis for a new body of thought on which a new system is to be organized, and then outline for you the first principles of the Anissa philosophy, which I will be referring to as we discuss theory over the next couple of days, so that you begin to see how all this thing connects together. So, okay, friends. I want to explain briefly 2 basic laws of logic without which thought cannot be coherent, and without which we wouldn't be able to understand each other. Now, there's a lot of laws of logic, so this is the quick mini course. One law is called the law of contradiction, and the other law is called the law of the excluded middle. Now, let me tell you what they are, and it'll make good sense to you. The law of contradiction is applied to propositions. A proposition is simply a statement about something, an affirmation about something that is just set forth. A position is a place, and a proposition is something that occupies the place before that place. So you set it forth, and then everything else comes behind it. So a proposition is simply an affirmation about the nature of something. And it could be wrong, of course. It could be true or false. So this law of contradiction applies to propositions. And it declares that any proposition cannot be both true and false. It says that something cannot have a quality and not have that quality at the same time. Now, it's interesting that when people use a line of argument and they violate this law, we sense something not quite right about the train of thought. And I think, at least I have come to believe that our minds were structured over billions of years of evolution simply to represent, in the way we're wired, an inability to accept things that violate this law. Now, there are certain realms of thought which seem truly paradoxical, and in some cases these paradoxes may appear to violate this law of contradiction. So the higher up you get, the more vague things might be. But when we're talking sort of down here where we live and work, if somebody's line of thought violates this law of contradiction, then we think something's wrong with his train of thought. The law of the excluded middle declares that any proposition must be either true or false. It cannot be somewhere in between. Either something is what it is or it ain't what it is. Can't be somewhere in between. Now when you put those two together, you have the basic two propositions, laws of logic, on which all proof depends. If one of these laws is violated, or if reality in fact is not set up in a way that we can discuss it within the framework of these laws, no proof is possible. Now, with that as a kind of little introduction, I want to talk about two basic kinds of knowledge. And these two kinds of knowledge are the subject matter of epistemology. What I talked about just a little while ago had to do with this. This part of philosophy is designed to check itself by virtue of examining the way it thinks about things, to make sure that its thought is as clear and accurate as possible. One kind of knowledge is called a priori. And I think you get the sense of the word meaning just prior. And by that it means that the knowledge is not contingent directly upon some experience. You can come by knowledge in a variety of ways, some of which will be dependent upon modes of thought and not upon direct experience. I'll give you an example in a moment. Both logic and math are chief examples of kinds of knowledge that are a priori. For instance, in order to see that 2 and 3 equals 5, we don't actually, every time we want to demonstrate that, have to get 3 objects and then put 2 more objects with them and then count them all. We can come to the conclusion 5 without going through that experience. Although, as we know, it's hard for a child to arrive at that conclusion. But once these basics are done, all kinds of new knowledge can be generated on the basis of deductive thought alone. Now, there's one branch of philosophers called rationalists, and they're the ones who stress a priori knowledge and deductively arrived at knowledge. Deduction simply means you have a premise, and if you apply the laws of deductive logic, you can come to a conclusion that will be true. The laws of logic themselves are known, for all intents and purposes, on an a priori basis. There's a big discussion about this, and we won't go into it, but I think you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Ewing gives an example, kind of a mundane example, of how you can come to know something by deduction and not by the actual experience. And he tells the story of a meeting where a group of people have assembled to hear a speaker, but the speaker has not arrived. And so they ask a priest in the audience if he would just come up and talk a little while, and to fill the time. Well, the priest decides to tell them a story of the first time he heard a confession, and what a kind of shocking experience it was. And he made the statement, "The first penitent I ever had confessed to me that he'd committed a murder. And he went on to say how difficult it was for him to accommodate that piece of information and so on. Well, presently the speaker arrived, he'd been held up and so on, and he saw the priest, and he got up and he said to the audience, he said, "You know, it's very strange, but I happen to be the first penitent that this priest ever heard." Now, the whole audience now knows that he committed a murder, but they never had access to the experience at all. They arrived at that knowledge entirely by deduction. And so their knowledge came to them through that route and not through direct experience. Now, much of our knowledge comes to us in this way. What did you say, man?
I just brought it.
Yes. You thought, oh, yes. The other kind of knowledge is empirical knowledge. It comes to us with first-hand experience. And these kinds of philosophers are called empiricists. And that makes some sense. And their chief approach is not induction, but it's not deduction, but induction. People get so easily confused over these two words. The operative syllable comes from duco, which means to lead or draw out or to draw. It's the same word. It's see, you can educe, you can have eduction or education. That's what education is supposed to draw out. Well, what does it draw out? Well, that's what Anissa is all about. What does it draw out? The important point here is that you are going from one point to another point, or from several points to another point. Deduction means you start with a general principle, and you can go to particulars from it. Induction means that you start with lots of them and come down to one. Now, some empiricists identify meaning entirely with the property of being verifiable. In other words, they think that if something isn't verifiable, it's really not meaningful. In fact, they would say it is meaningless. That's a pretty extreme position, but a lot of them have built a case for it. And therefore, the empiricists tend to dismiss real metaphysical statements. Unfortunately, their verification principle itself is not verifiable, and therefore it contains its own demise, because it's one of those self-rejecting propositions. You say, there is no assertion that can be made that is true. Well, since that itself is an assertion, it now, if that is true, rejects itself. You see the complication? Well, we are often not sensitive to these kinds of things, but a lot of our thought runs in those kinds of circles, and that's what's called muddle-headedness. Now, let me give you an example of a kind of empirical knowledge. You might say empirical knowledge is contingent knowledge. It hinges on something else. For instance, there is no way to look at a bridge and say that it's safe, although there may be a way of looking at a bridge and saying it's not safe, if you can see that half of the supports are rusted away and so on. But the safety of the bridge is subject to it's subject to testing out. You can actually put some weight on it and run a truck across it, and if the bridge collapses, you now know it wasn't safe. Or if it shakes and wobbles, you can test out its safety. But it would be hard to come to the knowledge of the safety of the bridge in an a priori way. It's one that is contingent upon the actual experience, you see. Now, the British empiricists, John Locke, and all those guys, and John Stuart Mill, were so successful in holding to that position, that if it's not verifiable, if it's not empirical, it is meaningless, that in the Academy of Science of Great Britain, which was largely dominated by chemists, they managed to keep the atomic theory of chemistry out for a couple of generations because nobody could see an atom. And today nobody's seen an electron or all those particles that they talk about. And it wasn't until that very severe empiricist approach could be broken that chemistry really took a leap forward and calculated all those atomic weights and so on. So, although this being empirical is important, it's very clear every time people insist on it too rigidly, creative advance in thought is snuffed out. So, from an ENISA point of view, we try to keep a balance. We go back and forth. And we have a leg in both camps. Because if you don't have some anchorage here, then it's very easy for people to flip out into just a sea of superstition about things. And that's equally bad too. And you'll see how Whitehead handles that whole thing in just a moment. Now, there have been interesting mixes of these two kinds of approaches, the rationalist and the empiricist approach in philosophy, and those mixes come out in a variety of ways, and they've had a number of names, so I'm just going to rattle off some so you get an idea of what the scope is. Progressivism, existentialism, idealism, realism, transcendentalism, essentialism, materialism, pragmatism, instrumentalism, naturalism, perennialism, reconstructionism, utopianism, neo-Freudianism, and neo-Marxism. Those are all identifiable streams of philosophical thought which incorporate different aspects of these and which have different mixes of the empiricist and the rationalist points of view. And if you were going to be a philosopher professionally, one of the things you would have to do is to understand the basic first principles of each of these approaches, because these approaches are largely characterized by the first principles on which they rest. And in some cases, some of them rest on the assertion that there is no first principle. You see? And that's their first principle, of course, but they don't like to accept that. I happen to believe in first principles myself. Because when you assert that first principles are necessary, that in itself can be a first principle that is necessary, and there's non-contradiction in operation there, and I think that's important. All right. Now, with that as a kind of a little prelude, I want to give you a little dose of Whitehead and talk a little bit about first principles, and then tell you what the first principles of the ENISA philosophy are. Whitehead said that the task of speculative philosophy, that's his cosmology, that's this book, the task of speculative philosophy is to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted. Well, that's a big job. Now, by interpreted, he means that everything which can be experienced, can be enjoyed, can come through the sense perception or that we can think of, would have the character of being a particular instance of something in that philosophical scheme. As to say, no matter what it is you do or happens to you, there is something in that philosophical scheme of ideas that you can connect it to. And by making that connection now, it will illumine that experience, because what it's connected to shows how, in an abstract way, it's connected to everything else. That's the purpose for having that general scheme up there, is that it illumines and helps you interpret what's going on to you, going on around you. Now, I think it's no mystery to you, or it's not unknown to you, that large part of our life is often spent muddling through, wondering why this happened and how this was connected to that, and so on. Really just in a kind of a mediocre state of tolerable confusion. Now there is a point at which it becomes intolerable, and when it becomes intolerable, there is ontological pressure and anxiety, and you may need to have some help somewhere. And from our point of view, the best help you can get is to adopt a scheme of thought that relates everything to everything else. Now, of course, if it relates things in a way that turns out to be wrong, then you may be in worse trouble than you were before you got it. But a lot of people's troubles, their anxieties and everything, comes from their not seeing how things are related. And in fact, neurosis and psychosis, the hallmark of both of those conditions is loss of meaning. And one of the things I did get out of that book by I.A. Richards on the meaning of meaning is that meaning inheres in grasping the relationships among things. And if you don't know how things are related, you can't connect with them. And if you can't connect with them, you'll be out of touch with them. And if you're out of touch with them, you can't have any effect on them. If you can't have any effect on things, you feel powerless. And if you feel powerless, you won't feel able to manage your own life. And that is a threat. And that threat will be experienced as anxiety and leads to depression, and depression unrelieved leads to suicide. So you get the picture. That's why we feel that an educational system which brings to the child the tools for hooking everything together will in fact be the basic antidote to both crime and mental illness ultimately. Because both of those pathologies are related to the same inner condition, namely the suppression of potential, and a lot of that suppression comes from, in essence, feeling powerless, and that comes from not knowing how things are connected together in some way, shape, or form, as I'll demonstrate as we go on. Now, take this idea then to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of experience can be interpreted. This is precisely what we're trying to do with Anissa. That once we have this body of thought and its real first principles organized and its theories and its propositions spelled out, there would not be anything that you would experience as a teacher in working with children anywhere that you could not interpret in terms of that scheme of thought. Well, I mean, we're not there yet, but we're a lot farther along than any other system we know of. Now, a little while ago, I talked with you about comparing Anissa with 22 other models. And by that, I meant they're not really models, they're more like approaches to education, like the Bank Street approach. See, what Bank Street is willing to make the assumption that if you provide opportunities for children in an open way, they will choose activities at their own developmental levels and therefore just keep them busy and they'll grow and develop and learn. It's not a bad proposition. It's just that from our point of view, it leaves too much up to chance. Or you might have a Montessori approach, which is far more ritualized. You might have Ira Gordon's approach, or Glenn Nimnick's responsive environments approach, or you might have Weichert's cognitively oriented curriculum, or you might have Breider Engelman or Don Bushell's behavior modification approach. In other words, those are approaches to education, but if you look at them, none of them has a clear philosophical base with identifiable first principles from which have been deduced a coherent body of theory that can function as a guide to practice to achieve particular objectives. And therefore, I don't think they can. We've looked at them all. And it's hard for us probably to be objective, but we're not blind, and I hope not stupid, and therefore we can compare feature for feature of the Anissa model with all the others. And the problem with the comparison is many of the features are missing in all the other models. For instance, there are no specifications in those other models. And therefore, that's why we don't think you ought to call them models. Because a model ought to be characterized by specifiable attributes that would enable you to identify the model when you see it. Because if you see it has these specifications, then you know it's ENISA and not something else, you see. Very much like when you take out a patent. There's a whole section in the patent called specifications, and that's where you spell out, you specify the things that identifies your invention and makes it distinguishable from all other inventions. And if you cannot have some of those specifications which are different from other people's specifications, you can't get the patent, because it means somebody else has already invented what you think you're inventing. See? All right. This process of interpretation is the most complicated issue in becoming an ENISA teacher, because we are not trained to do it, nor are we experienced in doing it, interpreting what we are doing in terms of some scheme of thought which we have studied and come to internalize. That's why the ENISA approach is not just a little book of recipes of a few things to do with children. You know, at 10:15 you take out the Cuisenaire rods, and at 11:30 you sing a little song, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon you take a field trip. Although those things might occur in an ENISA school. But the ENISA teacher is one who has internalized that scheme of thought, has a sense of its philosophy, understands the theory, and therefore can interpret every situation in terms of that theoretical frame of reference and use it as a guide to a very generative mode of practice. Now this is important, because if a teacher year after year does exactly the same thing at the same time, following the same lesson plan which she put together in the previous decade, she herself will not be growing. And since we know that modeling is a powerful form of teaching, it is important for that teacher to model the process of perpetually growing and developing by being an avid learner, a competent learner herself, you see. That's why we had to go the theoretical route. Because once we were caught in that situation of accepting that huge body of empirically verifiable evidence that children learn by being in the presence of somebody modeling what it is they're trying to learn, then we knew that we had to have teachers ultimately who were competent learners and who loved learning, and one of whose great passions in life is learning. And for us, that came down to mean an interest in interpreting experience freshly, perpetually over time. And that means to become something of a philosopher, and when you are a professional, to operate on the basis of theory. Very interesting. Some of you may have seen the Constructive Triangle, which is the summer 1975 issue of the Montessori Teaching Journal, which is, it says ENISA issue. The whole issue is on ENISA, because this year they had their entire national conference, or half of their entire conference, based on a presentation of ENISA. And of course there was a lot of questions about what is the difference between Montessori and ENISA, because a lot of what ENISA says confirms much of what Montessori did, but it also says some things about what some of the Montessorians do that we wouldn't go along with necessarily. But at this meeting, J. McVicker Hunt was present. He is one of the great developmental psychologists of our time. He's now an old man with white hair in his 70s, but vigorous. He's a professor emeritus from the University of Illinois. He's still doing research with children. And Pattabhi Raman and Sue Thoreau and I were out there for this 4 or 5 days of their national conference, and we sort of jumped up for joy when he got before these 600 or 700 Montessorians and said, I haven't been with you for 11 years. 11 years ago was the last time I spoke to you, and I've sort of kept an eye on what you've been doing. And I have a piece of advice for you. And his advice was this: get away from ritualized recipes and seek out the general theoretical principles that may be reflected in the recipes, so that you can generate new recipes and therefore feel excited about your work, as well as providing some fresh experiences for the children. In other words, he said, you must become theoreticians. Well, we never heard anybody else put it quite so strongly to teachers before, but we felt that to be an enormous confirmation. And then he went on to give some experiences and some anecdotes to illustrate his point. Now, just a couple of perspectives on this business of interpretation, because it is both the task of philosophy and theorists as well as scientists. But perhaps the difference between interpretation as a task of science and a task of philosophy lies in the idea of universality and necessity, which lies with speculative philosophy. This is what Whitehead says, a necessary system of general ideas. By necessary, he means that it has to work. It is necessarily so, not just arbitrarily so. And Whitehead suggests 4 criteria to be applied to look at the quality of a system of thought. First of all, is its logicality. Does it obey those laws of logic? Does it accept the law of contradiction and the law of the excluded middle, plus all the others that I didn't have a chance to go into? Number 2, is it coherent? That is to say, does everything hang together with everything else in some way? You can't have a little piece over here that denies a little piece over here. They have to be connected in some way. Third, its applicability. That means that everything you experience in the classroom can be understood in terms of something in that body of thought. Give some concrete examples in the course of the week. And fourthly, is it adequate? Adequacy. And by adequacy, he means that there are no items of experience not capable of being interpreted by the scheme. Now, we realize that we really step out on a little bit of thin ice here in claiming the adequacy of the Anissa model. And so that statement rests for us in relative terms. If you could ever find a more adequate model, we would like to see it, because we would immediately then change our model to make it more adequate than the one you bring up, because we're not interested in staying the way we are. We're just interested in getting better and better, which is what science is about. Again, let me caution you a little bit about the problem of language. And because we're going to be using some terms in the next 4 or 5 days, which will have to be endowed with some new meanings. And your natural tendency will be to cram the word I'm saying into a previous idea that you have, which will put you out of touch with what I'm saying. And since I know that tendency and have some experience with it, I'll be harping on it just a little bit, just to make sure that we're not doing that. Whitehead mentions the enormous ambiguity of language and in conveying exactly what we mean. So there's a little problem there. And that's why we're such a bugs on definition, as you will see. Jeff did recently a paper for his comprehensive exams on language development, and he cites a couple of statements there to show the terrible ambiguity. For instance, if I say the statement, "They are eating apples," What does that mean to you? Does that mean these apples are for eating? They are eating apples. Or does it mean these people over here are eating these apples? They are eating apples. Now, part of the meaning of that sentence is carried in the tonality of the voice, which is one of the things a child learns to pick up very early, because we can say, they are eating apples, or we can say, they are eating apples. Now, if I say, they are eating apples, it means that they're not cooking apples. Well, I have to say they are not cooking apples in a very special way too, otherwise you'll think these people are not cooking these apples, you see. Now, the quality of the tone of voice is not possible when you're writing. That's why writing is such a bitch. It really, it just tears the soul to pieces. You try to get yourself down on paper and say what you mean. And that's why children must be encouraged to write from the very first moment that they can begin, to get their thoughts down. Because writing means not depending on anything else but the clarity of the line of thought. And now, since in school we don't, the little essays that kids write in school are never critiqued well, because there's not enough time. So by the time they get to the university, they're illiterate. Really. Grown people are illiterate. Well, we got there, we were illiterate ourselves. We came up through that system. So it's been quite a struggle for us to sort of impose upon ourselves a system of compensatory education. And we do it by having each other read our works and question whether or not that's what we mean. Now, Jeff gives another example where the tonality doesn't even help. If you say, visiting relatives can be fun, what does that mean? Does that mean that the relatives have come to your house? Or does that mean you've gone to visit your relatives? It's very hard to change the tonality of voice, too, to make that clear. It's just not going to be clear. Therefore, the only way to make it clear is to have it in context. And that means it has to belong to a system. And therefore, the Anissa model represents necessarily a vast, comprehensive system of thought simply by virtue of the utter necessity of making things clear. They have to appear in a context. And you have to spell out what the context is, and that's what the philosophy in large part does. Because when you hear a given statement in the Anissa model, by itself it may be ambiguous. But when you place it in the total context, then you can make the right interpretation. Hence, it is never possible for groups of people, teachers, to be trained in the Anissa model without understanding the philosophical base. You just won't be able to understand what some of the sentences mean without that context. Okay, a statement of Whitehead about that, and then we'll go on. Whitehead says, philosophy must redesign language in the same way that in the physical sciences, pre-existing appliances had to be redesigned. Formal language is required for both philosophy and science. Hence the attention which we give to the framing of definitions. Now, I want to move to the idea of first principles. The reason for having first principles is that they are the way to guarantee coherence. And coherence and logicality are two rationalistic ideals which we insisted on living up to as best we could. The reason coherence is so important is that things that are coherent make sense, and therefore they have meaning in them. But secondly, actions based on a coherent body of thought by groups of people will be extraordinarily effective because no energy is wasted by being expressed in patterns of action which go in the opposite direction. In other words, we want, if ANISA is going to be different from ordinary systems, it means that the energies of the people who belong to that system have to be expressed in patterns of behavior that accomplish the purposes of the model. If you have vast amounts of energy leaking through the cracks or going in opposite directions, then that system will not be terribly efficient. It will take longer to accomplish some things, and in fact, some energies may be just downright harmful or counterproductive. Now, Whitehead says that incoherence stems from disconnectedness or arbitrariness among first principles. Now, I would even go one step further, or maybe one step before that, and say there is no possibility of having coherence if you don't even have first principles. Now, a few weeks ago, we had a team of people from the State Department coming down to look at the certification of the School of Ed, or accreditation for the School of Ed at UMass. And they were, we just have dozens of programs. They've proliferated enormously over the last few years. And so Don and I went down to be interviewed by these people. And they were worried about a number of things. Number one, taking a definite philosophical stand seemed unusual for them because usually a School of Education just presents what Piaget says and Dewey says and Hunt says and so on, you see, on down the line. And then the poor person who's taking the course can just take it or leave it. And what they usually do is leave it. In our experience, they all leave it. And then they go to teach after having left it all. And what they do is just try to follow a little bit what the supervising teacher does. But there's no connection between all that. And the research is in now. Those child development courses, all those foundation courses in educational philosophy and ed psych, did not change the behavior of the teacher one whit. All they did was accumulate credits, which got written down in the registrar's office and enabled you to become certified. The system is anti-rational. It is incoherent. So Don and I said the ANISA model is designed to represent a coherent system of education which could therefore be efficient by virtue of the fact that the energies of the people in the system would be pulling in the same direction. And this woman said, well, what makes you think the traditional systems are incoherent? And we said incoherence stems from arbitrariness or disconnectedness among first principles, or we added hastily, having no first principles. So we said to the assembled delegates, what are the first principles of education? Well, they just lost their teeth. Their mouth just dropped open. I said, think for a moment. We'll pause for 5 minutes. It seemed like half an hour. While you think of the first principles of education. Well, finally, one woman said, well, I'm not quite sure what a first principle is. Somebody offered ordering textbooks on time. You can see why they might think that's a first principle, but that's not quite what we had in mind. Though, of course, if you don't get the textbooks orders on time, it is a bit of a mess. You had to agree. I can tell you honestly, friends, I have asked dozens of professional educators, what, in your opinion, are the first principles of your profession? And I have never, not ever, met one who had an answer. Now, they can think up one after a while, but the idea had never even occurred. Now, that means that education as a profession in our society has never organized itself on a rational basis. And without that kind of basis, it can never hope to be comprehensive on the one hand, nor can it hope to be adequate and powerful on the other. And what we are trying to do is to take care of that problem. Therefore, we had to be concerned with the identification of first principles, which could function as the philosophical premises from which could be deduced a coherent body of theory, which could be a guide to practice. In other words, it would guide the use of the energies of the people in the system so that all the energy is pulling in the same direction. And that means it'll be more effective because it's all going not at cross purposes, but in the same direction. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Herbert Spencer, who lived at the time of our own Civil War. He was writing in the 1860s, who came on this issue of first principles and in fact wanted to build philosophy into a super science. His philosophy is called synthetic philosophy, and he felt that philosophy should become a special science whose function would be to unify all other sciences. And in many ways, what he was attempting to do was not all that different from what Whitehead was attempting to do, and so on. He believed that his science, his synthetic philosophy, the science of all sciences, would be not made up of a lot of general laws, but in fact, he would find one law from which all others could be deduced in an a priori way. Say, it wouldn't have to be subject to experience. It wouldn't be contingent upon experience. And he offered a new definition of philosophy as completely unified knowledge. Now, he started with what the physicists considered to be two very well-established first principles in his day, just as a point of departure. One of these principles was the continuity of motion. It's kind of one of the first principles of physics. And the other was the indestructibility of matter. You know, if you burn this paper, you don't destroy it, you simply change the form. Part of it goes off in a gas called carbon dioxide, and part of it remains as carbon and ash. Now, it's true, we haven't found a way to grab the carbon dioxide back and unite it with the ash and the carbon and make the paper again. But the indestructibility of matter, I think, has been pretty well demonstrated. He took those two principles and said to himself, how can I unify those into one as just an exercise? And he came to the idea that matter and motion are simply different forms of energy. And you can see this is heading in an organismic direction, and it's preparing the foundations for Einstein's work. If motion and matter are simply two forms of energy, then those two principles could be combined into one, and he called this principle the persistence of force, or the prevalence of energy. And one of the deductive consequences of that proposition would simply be that every loss of motion must result in the accrual of matter, and every loss of matter must result somewhere in an increase in motion. And of course, why Einstein got the idea that
E equals mc.
sorry, that was back. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. C meaning the word constant, which is what he was taking as the basis. That's why this microphone right here is simply, in Einstein terms, concentrated energy. It's dense, relatively speaking, compared to out here. And our skin, in a sense, represents a boundary within which energy is condensed. Although it's moving, I mean the boundary is moving because it's flexible. I can move my arms, you see. But at some point I can disappear and I can be transformed into another form. But the actual things that I made up wouldn't be absolutely destroyed. I'll be buried one day and I'll rot, and part of me will then be probably fertilize some grass, and the grass will grow and I'll be in part of the grass, and some cow will eat the grass and it will give milk, and then some baby in Detroit will drink the milk, and now I'm in that baby. And it gets very complicated after a while, but it does it does demonstrate the interconnectedness of all the universe, you see. No doubt we are part of all kinds of other people who've gone on before us in a physical sense anyway. Well, Spencer's great search for a unifying principle to explain the order and structure of the universe led him to arrive at a very basic principle, which he called the principle of evolution and dissolution. And then he showed deductively what others found out inductively, namely that change is always from a state of homogeneity to a state of heterogeneity. And you begin to see now the idea of two forces in the universe, one which is building things up into increasingly complex structures, and the other which is breaking things down. One is called entropy, and one is called, well, life, is what Whitehead said, or non-entropy, I think is what George was talking with me about during the break. You know, the sun is getting colder. In a few billion years, it will go out. And when it goes out, that's the end of us here, unless we find an alternative source of energy. Or we must journey to another planet that has similar conditions. I don't know where that will be, because we need to find one that's about the same distance from another star, which would have the similar conditions, oxygen and all that stuff. That general winding down of the universe is entropy, and entropy means energy that is unavailable to accomplish a purpose. Now, Whitehead points out that the whole universe isn't winding down. There are some elements of it that are building up, and that's what life is. First organic, first vegetable, animal, and then man, being the highest point of that counter force. And that building up force involves the creation of more complex organized units, where large things are brought together and unified and have some kind of purpose. And you will see when we get to the Anissa theory of development that it derives and is consistent with the general force of evolution in the universe, and therefore rests squarely on what we know about evolutionary forces. He said that evolution is a passing from a less to a more coherent form of energy. And this process is built up through differentiation and integration. That's what evolution is. And it takes place in a given human being biologically, and it takes place psychologically through learning. Our question is, what kind of learning? And we have defined learning in a way then that shifts the foundation of education away from simply assimilating information to another kind of learning which we try to get our children to do, and which makes Anissa different from all other educational systems. Okay, now with all of that tucked in your bonnets, I come to a blank sheet, which I will project on because it's all in my head. It has to do with these first principles of the Anissa model, which we got by sifting through all of these books and asking all these questions, and which when you internalize, will provide for you that general context within which you can sort out the ambiguities of given statements. But you see, in 5,000 years, it would probably be disintegrated. It's just that it's changing so slowly that we recognize it as the same chair. But in fact, every time it gives up one electron, it's a different chair. It's the previous chair minus one electron. And that's not a very big change. And of course, when you have a child and that child grows up, the changes are much more quicker. Because they're building up and then they get old and they give off. They put on weight but give off something else. I'm not quite sure what, but there are changes that take place. And if the changes aren't too fast, we see continuity in that object or that thing. But everything changes. Now once you say then that the whole universe is not characterized by static actuality, you are interested in change, and that means you are interested in process. And it goes on to say, process presupposes potentiality. If you are in condition A here and you are progressing to be something different, say B, the possibility of becoming B must have existed potentially when you were A. Who you are now, in precisely the way you are, had to exist potentially at the moment the sperm and the egg came together that made you in your mother's womb. By process, Whitehead means the translation of potentiality into actuality. So you're going to find this basic idea, potentiality into actuality, the first principle of the Anissa model. That's what is meant by development. That's what is meant by creativity. In fact, Whitehead says the translation of potentiality into actuality is creativity, and he labeled that the universal of universals. So this model grows out of a very general conception of the nature of creativity. And the purpose of the educational system then becomes to organize experience for the child such that his potentialities are actualized at an optimum rate. Now, given that there are a number of first principles, some of them might be kind of second principles. We haven't sort of numbered them. We just made sure that all of them taken together didn't contradict one another because we wanted the system to be coherent. This model is designed to serve men, human beings, Homo sapiens. And therefore, it had to take into consideration the nature of the creature for whom the model is intended. Therefore, many of the first principles might be regarded as propositions about the nature of man. We think it's inappropriate to even think of what kind of a building you're going to build without thinking of the nature of man. Of course we do. We don't build, we do that to a certain degree because we wouldn't build a place where the ceilings were 6 feet off the ground, and we put the doorknobs where they're convenient to reach, and we have running water, and we have to have light, we need toilet facilities. So we do design the buildings, generally speaking, to accommodate things about our nature that we are familiar with. The question is, are there some things that a deductive, analytical, theoretical approach would reveal to us about the nature of men, which would direct us to build buildings differently for educational purposes? And our answer is definitely. One of our long-range hopes is to make a breakthrough in school architecture, which would provide alternative structurings of the physical environment to enhance growth and development. Now, of course, a lot of it's going to be the same. There'll be chairs, and there'll be floors, and there have to be ceilings, and a few things like that. But there will be some changes. One of the first propositions, or first principles in the philosophy of the Anissa model, pertinent to the nature of man, is this: that there is no way of conceptualizing a limit on man's potentialities. In a sense, this has to come to one as a kind of belief, because if you believe otherwise and you relate to children on the basis of their limitations rather than relating to them as open-ended creatures capable of perpetual development, your relationship to them will wind up being suppressive of their potentialities. Another fundamental first principle of all of creation, which has a bearing upon the nature of man, is Whitehead's definition of reality as process. That's why this book is called Process and Reality. And this book tries to relate process to even more ultimate principles, and that's why it's called Process and Divinity. But I haven't read the book yet, so I'm not quite sure what they're getting at yet. Except that, well, in Whiteheadian terms, I kind of think I know, which I might explain a little bit later. Whitehead says that if everything is changing from one thing into another, it is going from potentiality to actuality, and therefore to be in touch with the reality of something must therefore necessarily mean being in touch with the process of its becoming. Now, what implication would that very abstract general philosophical principle have for a teacher working for a child in the Suffield public school systems? Well, a lot. Let me just say one. If you give a child a test, the minute the child hands the test in, he's changed. And therefore that test is not the real person, is not a reflection of the real person. Only partially is it. And if you therefore use those test results as a way of relating to the child on the basis of his limitations, you will ultimately be suppressing him. The only legitimate function of a test, then, from an Anissa point of view, is to assess the developmental level of the child, trying to find out where he is in the process of translating potentiality into actuality, so you can arrange things so that he can go on to the next level. None of us are the same people that we were when we came to the room this morning. We've all changed a little bit, not the least of which we've aged a few hours. That seems to go on inevitably. That's why people have been searching for the fountain of youth. They'd like to reverse the process, but Whitehead says the reason time is irreversible is because process is there. And Whitehead's definition of time has a lot of implications for children, because we believe that time is measured by the clock. And he said, no, time inheres in process. And that's why, when you read the Whiteheadian elucidation of the phenomenon of time, you will understand children much better. When a child is doing something that is not facilitating the translation of their potentialities into actuality, time seems to drag. And Sarah, my little Sarah, always accused the clock of being mean. to her, because when she has to do something she didn't like, she accused the clock of slowing up enormously. And conversely, when she was doing something she loved doing, accused the clock of just whizzing around. Because that subjective time for the experiencing organism is the real time, and the clock time is something else. Therefore, children will bring to the educational system different rates of becoming on different dimensions. And if you organize your entire class around the clock, you will be violating a fundamental principle of ANISA. Now, there are constraints of living in a civilized system, and therefore things have to start at a certain time, and chances are the children have to go home at a certain time, otherwise the whole system just becomes somewhat unmanageable. However, if we were doing it absolutely right, we would have smaller organic communities where children just learned by virtue of what they did from morning to night with the people they did it with. And they would do what they were doing for the right amount of time, and after which they would stop. And that right amount of time would be determined by whether or not it's actualizing their potentialities, or whether or not they had to do it for some other reason, like maintaining a level of support for food coming in, or shelter, or whatever. After all, if the organism dies, then psychological potentialities don't get released, but we're going to get into those theories a little bit later. All right. Our idea was to put a teacher in touch with the reality of the child so she could be effective in working with the child. In other words, getting the teacher to get behind the appearances of little Johnny, who's 4 feet tall and a bundle of energy, has got dark hair and brown eyes, or whatever. In other words, if we could find or generate a body of theory that would explicate this process, then teachers, in applying those theories, could come in contact with the reality of the child. Now, you're never going to get 100% in touch with the reality of anything. The question is, can you get closer than you are? The idea being, the closer you are in touch with something, the more effective you can be in working with it. I've never met anybody who would believe otherwise. That would seem to be a violation of one of these a priori propositions. See? That meant, once we got into this, that teachers had to be in touch with process then, to be in touch with children. But the problem was, mind you, that there seemed to be an infinite number of them. There seemed to be 10 to 20 million billion ways of defining or identifying a process. So we came to the conclusion that we would try to find major patterns of becoming and explicate those and build a curriculum around them, or build part of the curriculum around them. And that would be the most we could do, and that would be 1,000,000 times better than what's being done now, if it could really be pulled off. That's the thesis. Time will tell whether or not we are in fact managing it. Now, when something exists in potentia, that means it's hidden. It means it's a possibility. Our theories try to explain what it is that makes certain potentialities become actualized and others not. And our theory also explains which ones tend to be more important than others, so that we can make sure all the kids get the most important ones. And then all the lesser ones we are willing to assume will more or less take care of themselves. In explicating this process of translating potentiality into actuality, we needed to define the forces which carry it forward. And those are all explained in the theory of development, which is designed to explicate going from potentiality into actuality, and we're going to deal with that tomorrow. This afternoon we're going to talk about theory and the nature of theory itself, and with some concrete examples. Now, one of the things, though, that is a first principle in the model and also speaks to the nature of man is this: that he is capable of storing his past symbolically in the form of memory. And that capacity is called the capacity for immanence. Now, the chief vehicle of immanence is memory. On Monday, is it Monday, Meg?
Yes.
On Monday, we're going to have a marvelous seminar on the nature of memory. If I can remember all of the things about it that I was supposed to say. And I'm going to put you through some experiences where you will come to understand the nature of forgetting and what you could do to forget less, and how you can work with children to increase the probability of their remembering. But immanence is very important because that sum total of one's past is half of the determinants, or the determining power of what you're going to become. So a teacher that's going to individualize instruction has to be able to get a fix on that. Otherwise, they will be asking the child to do things that doesn't connect. If it doesn't connect, it doesn't have meaning. If it doesn't have meaning, it can't be remembered. If it can't be remembered, it doesn't become a part of immanence. And it means you didn't change any by virtue of that experience, or very little. A purpose of testing might be to sample immanence. But you can't stop there. This is always what you've been. And what you've been isn't entirely what you are. That's why if you try to relate to a child just on the basis of what he's been, he will feel not accepted totally. Now, the big flaw, to make a point on this issue, the big flaw of Freudian approaches to psychotherapy is that it almost entirely rests on a rehearsal of what you've been. There is no way of changing if there's a constant rehearsal of what you've been. And when I came to recognize that weakness in the Freudian thing, or what I claimed to be a weakness, I worked for 5 years as a therapist myself, and shifted to a new approach. What is it, then, that would enable you to escape just remaining what you were, because you're always rehearsing what you've been? The trick is to decide what you might be and rehearse that for a change. Now, when you make a projection of what you might be, and then organize the power and energy of knowledge that your past represents in this new way, another capacity of man is being exercised, and that's transcendence. Now, this is past, this is future, and these two things are brought together in the present, which yields one consciousness. And consciousness itself is impossible without being able to symbolically represent what you've been and what you might be. That's why the symbol systems in the ENISA model, as you will see, are at the core of the curriculum. And dear Jeff is doing his doctoral dissertation on the area of symbolization, of which language is one part. So consciousness is another first principle of the model insofar as it specifies one of the critical characteristics of man. And it is tied in with another descriptive feature of man, namely his power to manipulate symbols. not the least of which is the capacity for articulate speech. You think how marvelous that is. You suppose I want to talk about a horse. If we didn't have a symbol for horse, it means every time I want to talk about a horse, I'd have to trot the horse in here, which would be quite a disturbance, although it would be far more exciting for the children than not trotting the horse in. And therefore, we should trot the horses in as much as possible for young children. But you can't trot everything in you want to talk about. That's why we can go so fast, is because we can deliberate on things not present, because we can hold them in our minds in their absence. And the only way we can hold our past in our minds is through those symbolic means, and the only way we can project our futures is through symbolic means, and when we bring the two together, they yield us consciousness. Now, you will see later that this becomes a very critical feature in defining the thrust of the model, which is learning competence, to make a competent learner. That all children know how to learn, that's to say they can learn, but they are never taught how to learn so that they are cognizant of the learning process itself such that they can take charge of it. That's why we define learning competence as the conscious ability to learn. Therefore, consciousness as a first principle in defining the nature of man is our learning competence model is in part derived from and is related to that first principle. Consciousness does other things too. It enables us to it enables us to know that we know. You see, dogs know things. They just don't know that they know. And the reason they don't know that they know is because they haven't got the symbolic means to represent that fact to themselves. And I don't think a few barks will do it. That's why Mama Dachshund doesn't pass on great folklore about her Dachshund genealogy to the puppies. There is no symbolic means to do it. And I'm just sure those few arfs are not language. They communicate some things, but they're not language in the specific sense of ours, you see. Therefore, to know that you know, in a sense, implies that you can ultimately know how to know, in which case you could be in charge of the process. And that's what we want Anissa schools to do for children, is to put them in charge of the process of knowing, because as you will see, knowing is one of the chief ways of actualizing potentiality. That's one of the chief ways you change from what you were yesterday to what you're going to be tomorrow. Is that you are different because you've learned something. Now supposing you could be in charge of that learning process, you could be then in charge of your own becoming. You could be in charge of your own destiny. And there is no more exciting adventure than being in charge of pursuing and planning your own destiny. It's quite a different ball game then that we're talking about when we're talking about educating children in this way. Well, tomorrow I'm going to take those few first principles and begin deriving for you a coherent body of theory and showing how that theory, when used to guide practice, yields a different kind of educational system. And we will try to delineate for you what part of that total system we have already initiated in Suffield, and what remains to be done, which is quite a bit. But a lot of that depends on us and not you, since we have a lot of work to do ourselves. Now, we have 4 minutes to answer burning questions, and I promise to leave more time, but I expect you to interrupt me for the questions as I'm going on. And so I'm kind of proceeding rather blindly on the assumption that your burning questions are being answered as I'm going, and if that's not the case, then you're letting me down. Any questions now? Yes, George.
Your concepts, your data language, your differentiation and integration would be analogous to the concept of conflict. For example, let me take the system as a whole. If you take the Marxian system, thesis, antithesis, which then ends up in some synthesis, his whole model of historicism is built on conflict. So the concept here that would be analogous that you have in yours of dealing with conflict would be that process of differentiation leading to integration.
Well, differentiation is not in itself synonymous with conflict. However, two different things may be in conflict, but their conflicts may be resolved by finding a higher order integrating principle. To be different in the fundamental sense simply means that they are distinguishable from each other by virtue of some properties or characteristics which they have, and that they can be integrated into some whole. And then that whole might be a differentiated element compared with some other whole, which when the two get together are differentiated elements which are going to be synthesized by a higher principle. And then those differentiated elements, which were wholes at one point in the hierarchy, now become parts, which are then related to make a bigger whole. And that's what the building up of the universe in life is all about, is the establishing of higher and higher order forms. But conflict, in essence, means using energy at cross purposes. And if you want the energy to flow in the same direction, then they have to be at one purpose, or in complementary purposes. But this is a big question. I'll have to talk with you about it later, George. Otherwise, we'll be here till supper.
That has been one of my disturbing things looking at the model, of how it deals with conflict itself. And I took some large elements here.
Sure, but no, I mean, the model does deal with conflict simply by virtue of searching out the elements by which two differentiated things can be related. But the differentiation itself is not ipso facto conflict. That's the point. Bon appetit. You to take this yellow sheet, and before we get into theory, I want to make a comment about each one of these questions so that you have a sense that we have at least covered these. Yes, one says statements about philosophy, and the other is the seminar. I think we've covered pretty well number one, what is philosophy and what is purpose. Philosophy is an attempt to disclose the reality of things, to form a scheme of thought which will illumine all of our experience and make it hang together. And I think you all got a good sense of that. Number two, why is it important for an educational system to have an explicit philosophical base? There are two. Well, there are a lot of reasons, but let's just talk about two. Number one, if it is explicit and you're consciously aware of it, then everything you do can be referred to that base. It therefore makes clear what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's a great benefit. Secondly, it means that what you do will all be devoted to achieving the objectives that you have in mind. Without a philosophical base, your objective may be something like just getting through the day without a major hassle or a major trauma. Well, that's not a very exalted objective. But I know a lot of teachers whose objective it is to just make it through the day. And I know a lot of teachers who experience that for the first 4 or 5 years of teaching. Well, you just can't be on top of things if that's your objective. Your objective has got to be phrased in terms of the kids. And therefore, it's important to have an explicit philosophical base, not only because it makes sense out of what you're doing and is a guide to practice ultimately, but because it gives you an overall sense of how to keep your energies invested in going in one direction. See, if you use energies for 5 minutes, it goes in that direction, and then energies in 5 minutes going in the opposite direction, you're just like what Nancy Rambusch calls an electric chicken. You're just bouncing around, and you're expending energy all right, but it's not accomplishing anything. 3, why was the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead chosen as the basis for the Anitha model? And this you ought to know because people will ask you. We wanted to make certain that this model rested on the best thinking in the history of man on this planet. Whitehead's philosophy is a remarkable synthesis of almost all of the philosophy clear back to Socrates. And therefore, his own work represented a kind of cashing in on, or capitalizing on, not only Western streams of thought, but Eastern streams of thought too, because Whitehead was very interested in Buddhism and Hinduism. Now, we have used Whitehead's philosophy as a means of checking ourselves on the scope, depth, coherence, logical consistency, and adequacy of our ideas. So I don't know whether you would say Anitha is a Whiteheadian educational system. In a way, I suppose you could say that. But there are some things about Whitehead that we don't quite understand. And Whitehead himself, in all these other books he wrote, Aims of Education, Adventure of Ideas, Science in the Modern World, the Philosophy and Science, Modes of Thought, Aims of Education, those books themselves are not very direct, systematical, logical derivatives of process and reality. So he didn't undertake the job himself. Of course, he, after all, it was near the end of his life that he did this and wrote all these books, and he didn't have teachers and a lab school and all these kinds of things to begin working with, and I'm not sure he would be inclined to anyway. And in any case, the generality of Whitehead's statements are just mind-boggling when it comes to look at things in human terms, because he's trying to phrase general laws which fit a frog, a human being, and the behavior of galaxies. And take something to just exactly see what you're going to do in the classroom when you have all of that. So it's comprehensiveness, scope, depth, coherence, adequacy. We used the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead to check ourselves on those dimensions. Now, number 4, I want to take a little time with, because I didn't have a chance to go into it in great detail this morning, and that's number 4. What differences become evident when a teacher holds an organismic versus a mechanistic view of man? Whitehead's cosmology is an organismic and not a mechanistic philosophy. It accommodates mechanistic phenomena, but its total basis is not mechanistic in nature. When Whitehead was asked, what is the chief distinguishing feature between a philosophy of mechanism and a philosophy of organism, he said, the introduction of the subjectivist principle. Now, let me tell you what that subjectivist principle is. You will come to appreciate how that explanation pulls us right down to what we're trying to do with children. A mechanistic view of the universe says that this entity, this being, it could be a child or it can be an atom, doesn't matter. The behavior of this is always caused by something outside itself. That's the mechanistic view of everything. The subjectivist principle says All right, part of its behavior may be influenced by outside events, but there is something inside it that enables it to determine how it will behave. In other words, its behavior is determined by the subject itself, subjectivist. Now, some examples to make the distinction clear. Western psychology, as represented in the work of B.F. Skinner and the behavioral modification people, is a psychological legacy inherited from Newtonian physics and the philosopher Descartes, whose view of the universe was mechanistic in orientation. And therefore, Skinner believes that the behavior of a child or a human being is not determined by the child himself, but is caused by external forces and events impinging upon the child. The thing I could never figure out is that all of those external forces impinging on the child, what are they caused by? I mean, if the mother decides to bawl the child out, who is causing the mother to bawl the child out to make the child's behavior be caused by the mother? I mean, somebody's got to cause the mother's behavior. Pretty soon, as Whitehead says, it becomes impossible to contemplate. The logical extrapolation of that view is that I cannot help saying what I am saying to you right now, and you poor things couldn't help coming to this seminar because your behavior was caused, and my behavior is caused, and we are helpless. We couldn't go home if we wanted to. Now, I don't want you to try to demonstrate to me that you can go home. I mean, I'm leaving right now. But I somehow feel that you could. And some of you might be just as ornery enough to do it on some occasion. Well, the distinction rests on understanding two different kinds of causes and accepting those two different kinds of causes.
I didn't put those down.
You didn't put those down, all right. Just wanted to see.
Sorry.
This kind of cause is called efficient cause. This kind of cause, a self-determining cause, is called final cause. Philosophers have been arguing about this for centuries. We agree that there are legitimate ways of incorporating both. Now, final cause is sensitive to purpose. For instance, the thing that caused my coming to Suffield this morning was a purpose I have in mind, namely to help initiate and consolidate the implementation of the ANISA model in Suffield. If I didn't have that purpose, it is very likely that I wouldn't be here. Now, take a child or a young person who decides to become a physician. One part of his purpose in life will be to become a physician. That then determines a great deal of his behavior. He has to get good grades in science. He has to take chemistry. He has to go to a medical school. He has to study hard. He has to pass his exam. He has to take an internship. And a huge amount of his energy and behavior will be determined by his purpose. Now, responding to purpose in this way is very akin to transcendence. Responding to efficient causes is more imminent in its nature. That's to say, when you are determined by what you've been, that's kind of an efficient cause. When you are determined by what you want to become, that's more of a final cause. This is why when I was working in therapy, I moved from this notion to this notion, because once I found I could get people to establish a purpose for their lives, it changed their behavior. Because if you want to accomplish your purpose, you have to use your energies in different ways than you were before, when you didn't have the purpose, you see. This next question, which is what is meant by, number 6, what is meant by the nature of man and what makes him a spiritual being? One of the things that we say makes a man a spiritual being is that although he's made up of physical atoms and molecules, he is able to respond to purpose as final cause. And that cannot be conceived as a physical force, like an efficient cause. See, if you ask somebody, why did this microphone go up in the air? What was the cause of it? The efficient cause is Dan Jordan's arm. And most physical scientists let it go at that. But there is another question, namely, why did it go up? Why did Dan Jordan's arm do it? Then you have to ask Dan Jordan. He will tell you that he had a purpose in mind. And that purpose was to demonstrate the distinction between final and efficient causes. That microphone, I swear to God, would not have been lifted just now by my arm if I had not the purpose of explaining my point. And therefore the efficient cause couldn't have even operated without the prior final cause. And it is the capacity of living organisms like men to respond to purpose as final cause that makes them spiritual. Yes?
I was wondering, the efficient cause, this child or young person, whoever, wouldn't be able to become a physician unless he had the environment and circumstances to, surround him to become an efficient physician in the end, right? So would that be, the final cause is there, he has a purpose, a very strong purpose, but how about environment and everything else involved?
You get the
in
point?
that situation?
She said maybe this guy wouldn't have gotten the purpose of being a physician. Maybe that his idea of becoming a physician was caused efficiently by being in a certain environment. There is no doubt that there is influence there. That's why we say the model accommodates both. But if you have a relatively rich environment, you could become a number of things: a physician, an engineer, a mathematician, or whatever. Who makes the choice? Are you going to take the position that the choice was not really the person's at all? Or are you willing to say, well, maybe he didn't make up the choice entirely free from all other influences, but he had a major say in it? See, we're willing to say, all right, the mother's influence, the father's influence, modeling, the availability of opportunities, background, will have some say about whether or not he becomes a physician. But we know lots of people who have all those opportunities and who decide to chuck it all and become a mountain climber, or a surfer, or something else. And, if you look at my own life, I started out to be a concert pianist. I have an undergraduate degree in applied piano. Then I went to England and I took a bachelor's of music and a master's of music in composition theory and history and started my PhD in musicology and got drafted. And in the course of that time, I decided, I can't think of anybody else who decided for me, to give all that up. And when I got out of the Army, I started all over again from scratch and did my BA, MA, and PhD in human development, which is an interdisciplinary course in how human beings grow and develop, starting from conception, going to death, from 4 disciplinary points of view: psychology, biology, anthropology, and sociology. And then I went back and did a postdoctoral sequence in brain chemistry, brain structure, and its relationship to memory, emotion, and learning. And it was very costly to start all over again. And in fact, to tell you the honest truth, I was surrounded by people who thought I was crazy and tried to talk me out of it. My determination to do it was in the face of so much advice not to do it. You see, so that I just can't believe that I couldn't help myself except to give up music and go back and do all these things, you see. So, and yet, there must have been something in my background which at least I was able to build on to make the shift, so that there were no doubt some influences somewhere around the line, you see. That's why you will see when your question is in part answerable in the epigenetic nature of our theory of development. Let me just say what that is briefly, and I'll reiterate it tomorrow. And that is that it is not environment, and it is not the organism solely that determines what the organism will become, but it is the qualities of both plus their interaction. And that's why you will see interaction with the environment then becomes a key feature. It is one of the propositions in the definition of teaching, the guiding of interaction. And this is the reason. See? But you make a good point. Nobody is going to become a great violinist, no matter how capable a violinist he might become, if he does not grow up in an environment where there is a violin.
Bringing it down into more subtle terms, as far as teaching goes, if we have a child who has very definite problems, and how do we help such a child to pull out his potential and help him out without the help of parents or community or whatever?
Yes.
Which is very possible. He's fine at school, goes home, comes in, he's terrible again. You know, it's
The question has to do with how do we help a child that's having severe problems.
Right.
The model provides the conceptual scheme for the analysis of the problem. And when we get to that point in theory, I will talk about that in some detail. Let me just tell you what it is for now. Every problem can be traced to a use of energy on the part of the child, which is at cross purposes with some other way in which he's using his energy. It gets to the conflicting thing that you were talking about, George. And so the system is used against itself, as it were. And I'll be able to give you some concrete examples of that as we get to it. But the notion of energy is a very critical one. And you'll see that the word potentiality itself comes from the past participle of the word to be. Summa est to sunt. That's the Latin I am, we are, you are. And the past participle of that is posse and potens, potential. And it means energy not yet expressed in potential. And when it's expressed, it is a power. And power means energy. And you'll see that we are very concerned with the way in which a child comes to use his energy. Our whole model rests on that notion. But I want you to get here the idea of what we mean by a spiritual being, and that's essentially what we mean. Now, for a lot of people, the word spiritual has terribly vague, mystical notions which they can't explain very well. I've asked a lot of people who like to use the word spiritual what they mean by it. And they may drag in the word soul. And then I say, what's a soul? And we're right back to the same problem. And even Whitehead, bless his heart, uses the word soul all the time, and he just takes it for granted. But I've never found a definition of it in here. And he defines everything else, but he just assumes everybody knows what a soul is. So, but it's not all that easy to define what you mean by it. So our definitions are far more penetrating, so that we can say what we mean when we use a particular word, and that we may use the word in different ways, but if we do, then we feel obligated to say how we're using it, because words can, like the word process, my goodness, that word gets worked to death, and in the model, and in a general sense it means one thing, but in a specific sense it means another thing, and you will see as we go into the theories later on some of the more specific meanings of that.
So how are you defining spiritual?
We are saying to be spiritual means to be able to respond to a non-physical force like a purpose. And that you are able to generate that purpose yourself. And one of the most common ways of embodying a purpose is to formulate an ideal. So to be responsive to ideals is to be spiritual. To respond to somebody poking you in the nose is more mechanistic and material. I mean, it hurts, and so you strike back, you see. But here, as a living organism, you are able to project yourself, what you might be, and then organize yourself to become that thing. And that makes you different from all other creatures. You see, when you plant the acorn, the oak tree exists in potentia in the acorn. And when you plant an acorn, you never get a maple tree, at least not in the history so far. And you and I kind of sense that we're not going to ever get it either. And Whitehead would say that the acorn is not free to be anything but an oak tree, and therefore every tree that comes from an acorn will reflect oak tree-ness. By that he means the leaves will be of a certain shape. The tree will generally have a certain shape, because you know the shape of the leaf and the size of the leaf determines how the branches will be, because the shape of the leaf and the distribution of the branches is designed to expose the tree to the maximum amount of sunlight so that photosynthesis is facilitated at the maximum rate. This tree, bless its heart, is interested in actualizing its potentiality at an optimum rate too. However, the precise leaf on a precise twig on a given branch is determinable by the oak tree itself. So it's not free to be a maple, and so on, but it can be its own specific particular oak tree, and it will have a certain say over it. And you know what? Whitehead says the same thing about an atom. He says an atom has not very much say over how it will behave, but it has a little say. Now, for instance, if you put a bunch of O atoms together and a bunch of H atoms together, you're bound to get water at some point. And Whitehead would say that these atoms don't have much of a choice about whether or not they're going to become water under certain conditions. They will become water. However, Whitehead says they do have, each oxygen atom has a little bit of say which particular hydrogen atom it wants to join up with. It just has to join. Now, the discovery of this principle is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. That's one of its expressions in physics. And the whole of physics has moved away now from a mechanistic basis to an organismic view of the universe. These little atoms have some say over their own destiny, though not as much as you have over your destiny. Now, one of the things that is pretty clear is the quality of your immanence can vary such that one kind of quality will cause you to believe that you have say over your destiny, in which case you will act as if you do. One other quality of immanence may cause you to believe that you have no say over your destiny, in which case you don't take advantage of the opportunities. The point of view of Anissa is to create a set of experiences which enables the child to accumulate a past, which is the platform for his seizing his own destiny and running with it. And really, I found this in therapy. Well, if a person felt that he didn't have any say over his destiny, he didn't make any efforts to change the way he was doing things. And I used to get him to change one little thing to show that he could. I'd say, go to bed 5 minutes later than you ordinarily do. And that should convince you that you have a say. Or get up 5 minutes earlier. And I gradually built up a set of things that the person came to realize, well, he can do lots of things. In fact, as he works through a year and a half of therapy, he comes to realize that he has an enormous say over what he can do. You have charge over your own energy. You can either squander it or you can use it productively. You can focus it on this or you can focus it on that. Far more than just an ordinary atom can. So as you get up into the higher levels of being, like being a man, human being, you have more say over things. And one of the chief ways in which you have a say is to project for yourself what you might be in the future and organize the present affairs in such a way that you get there. See, it's very doubtful that your pooch is able to decide what it wants to be in all that clear terms and then set out to become it. See, I've just never heard my little dachshund say, I want to be the best dachshund in this neighborhood, and he set about doing it. In fact, she's a very bad dachshund. And that's largely because we didn't train her very well. And it's not that she didn't want to, but you know, if you have to go to the John and nobody will let you out, there is a limit. And that limit causes actions which lead to bad habits. So I'm trying to not be mad at my dachshund, but mad at my wife and my kids for not treating this dachshund in the proper way.
Final cause.
Your final cause, that's right. Number 5, I think we did pretty well. What statements represent first principles from Whitehead's philosophy and which have been adopted as important elements of the Anissa philosophy of education? Now, would you pick up the second document, which is part of the Whitehead quotes. I brought a whole additional set to those that Mag brought. I wrote a whole lot of them out here. And I want to just read some of them and talk about them briefly so that you begin to get a more detailed sense. The first one is Whitehead's assertion that a philosophic outlook is the very foundation of thought and life. He says, as we think, so we live. Now let's face it. What you spend your time thinking about will be the things that you invest your life in. And if you think just about trivial stuff, your life will be invested in trivial things. Einstein became Einstein because he invested his thought into certain issues and problems. And you have some say over what that thought should be. Now, you may not think you do, but you do. And if you decide teaching isn't for you, you could tomorrow decide to go into some other profession. You go back to school, or you get on the job training, you do whatever you want to. And I know because at a very critical point in my life, as I told you, I picked up, chucked the whole thing, and started all over. At what might be considered an enormous cost. You know, I was prematurely aged by the time I had my first children, and all these kinds of things, you see, and all my friends already had houses and refrigerators and TVs and cars, and I was still thumbing a ride. And I was pushing around this little Volkswagen that was, was manufactured in the previous dispensation, and just would hardly make it. And all my doctoral students for a long time were driving big Chevrolets and all this, and I was still, even as a professor, pushing around this little Volkswagen, crippled and certainly had no reflection of status, that's for sure. But, you invest your energies where you want to. Why did it make that point? Yes.
The notion of drives that push us, the Freudians would use the notion of unconscious processes or even emotions. This is really saying that much of our behavior is determined rationally, cognitively, primarily.
Can be.
Can be. Could you speak to
yes,
that?
It isn't necessarily. And that's why the Anissa model focuses so definitely on affective development being organized around rational thought. Because one of our propositions is that an integrated personality is one who feels like doing what it knows it ought to do in order to foster its own growth and development. And conversely, it is one that doesn't like to do or want to do what it knows it oughtn't to do. See, people who hate doing what they ought to do and love doing what they shouldn't do are in a bad state. And we all have some problems along those lines. And in fact, it's sometimes irritating to be around somebody who loves doing what's right and hates doing what's wrong. But those people really sail. So they don't have any energy used at cross purposes. So the point is, can you teach children in such a way that their emotions and their thoughts become organized in a way that they pull in the same direction? We say yes, it can be done. And not in a way that predetermines how the child will become. The child has a lot of free play in making a lot of these decisions himself. The only thing we want to ensure is that we don't, through fear or punishment, have him come to hate the things he needs to like doing. And furthermore, we want him to come to love to do the things that he needs to do in order to go on growing and developing. See? Freud's own statement about psychoanalysis is a telling one, but it is a statement that is repressed, suppressed by psychiatrists. Freud said at the end of his career, and he's written it, he said, psychoanalysis is a theory because of its coherent scheme is beautiful on that level. The only problem is it doesn't work. Now, you see, the most medical people who have gone to that branch of medicine called psychiatry, see, a psychiatrist is a medical person with a knowledge of psychology, usually from a Freudian perspective. A psychologist is somebody who's got all the training in the way the mind works, but without the medical degree. My own background was as a psychologist on the one hand, and taking most of the courses in the medical students, but not having the clinical experience of pathology in terms of actual disease. I did work for a year in a psychiatric ward and worked with mental patients for a year, all the most severe kinds of cases. suicidal, manic depressive, obsessive, kleptomania, everything. Character disorders, conversion hysteria is the whole thing. And I became convinced after that experience that